Most people in Europe and North America don't have an income problem, but they sure do have a spending problem. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative and welcome on my casting couch. Alright, so this is part 2 of the discussion concerning the individual spending problem that seems to be plaguing way too many people, even though in real assets available, those that are now in their 20s and 30s start from a much better position overall, even though on some metrics they don't. I mean, yeah, sure, for instance, housing is, at least on paper, more expensive than 40 or 50 years ago, but nobody seems to be accounting for the difference in meaning. I mean, what does a house mean today? 50 years ago, a median house was about 120 square meters, or 1,300, I think, 1,300 I think, square feet. But today that's double. I mean, the median house is double now in North America. And yes, the price is not double, but more like 2.5 times higher on average. We'll talk about the specifics of certain areas soon enough. So housing is effectively more expensive, but not really by much on a 50-year period. And the difference is also accounted for what it offers. Lighter materials, more resilient materials, more amenities, and generally more comfort. I mean, it's easy for the youngsters or the youth to say today, oh, well, man, but, you know, the boomers had it cheaper because they had cheaper houses. Well, yeah, they did, but they also had crappier houses, which, by the way, can still be a thing today, if not for the millennial leftist voting joining their boomer friends in making such houses illegal to build in the current year. Because another aspect is exactly the legislation. What was perfectly reasonable and legal 40 years ago is now oftentimes illegal. And that makes building affordable houses, well, it makes it harder. Anyway, as opposed to the last video, when I offered a list of tips and tricks, in this video we'll be looking primarily at the US with some comparison to Europe, and we'll be looking at two stories that talk about debt. And we'll start by looking at the story from the Wall Street Journal titled "Families Go Deep in Debt to Stay in the Middle Class," which is the funniest title they could give for I mean, at least two reasons for why this is essentially the funniest title that they could have given. The first reason is, if you have to go into debt to be in the middle class, then that means you're probably not in the middle class and unlikely that you ever were in the middle class. And the second reason is that this kind of habit is terrible for your long-term financial health. I mean, what makes this article fascinating to me, and this is why I wanted to comment on it with y'all, is that this kind of behavior is engaged in by allegedly intellectual and smart people in North America. I mean, such behavior here in Eastern Europe is only reserved to the very uneducated simpletons who go abroad to work, make more money than they know how to manage, and then end up spending them on status symbol bullcrap. But even then, our simpletons at least make these mistakes on their own dime and don't expect to be bailed out by society. They just suck it up, go work some more, and perhaps, maybe at best, learn something from that mistake. But what this article describes is people who are not allowed to fail miserably and thus denied the opportunity to learn. And that is a terrible development. Anyway, buckle up, because this article is pretty long and I have a lot of comments to make, and yes, we'll go through all of it. So it goes like this, quote, "The American middle class is falling deeper into debt to maintain a middle class lifestyle. Cars, college, houses and medical care have become steadily more costly, but incomes have been largely stagnant for 2 decades despite a recent uptick. Filling the gap between earning and spending is an explosion of finance into nearly every corner of the consumer economy. Consumer debt, not counting mortgages, has climbed to $4 trillion, higher than it has ever been after adjusting for inflation. Mortgage debt slid after the financial crisis a decade ago, but is rebounding. Student debt totaled about $1.5 trillion last year, exceeding all other forms of consumer debt except mortgages. Auto debt is up nearly 40%, adjusting for inflation in the last decade, to $1.3 trillion. And the average loan for new cars is up, in inflation-adjusted terms, 11% in a decade, to $32,187, according to an analysis from a credit reporting firm, Experian. Unsecured personal loans are back in vogue, the result of competition between technology-savvy lenders and big banks for borrowers and loan volume. The debt surge is partly by design, a byproduct of low borrowing costs the Federal Reserve engineered after the financial crisis to get the economy moving. It has reshaped both borrowers and lenders. Consumers increasingly need it, companies increasingly can't sell their goods without it, and the economy, which counts on consumer spending for more than 2/3 of GDP, would struggle without a plentiful supply of credit. In one sense, the growing consumer debt is a vote of confidence in the future. People borrowing money today expect to have the income tomorrow to pay it back. Consumer debt tends to rise when borrowers feel secure in their jobs. But the debt pile is also an accumulated ledger of economic risk. It should be manageable so long as unemployment remains low. If job losses begin to rise, it would become unsustainable for some share of borrowers, raising chances of an increase in missed payments and lenders writing off unpaid balances. The Fed lowered interest rates on Wednesday because it sees rising risks of a slowdown that could boost unemployment. Median household income in the US was $61,372 at the end of 2017, according to the Census Bureau. When inflation is taken into account, that is just above the 1999 level. Without adjusting for inflation, over the 3 decades through 2017, incomes are up 135%. Okay, let's stop here for a second. So, let's put all of this into perspective a little bit, shall we? So, they say here median household income in the US is $61,372 at the end of 2017. Now, let's take that number for granted and let's compare it with the median household income globally, which stands at an astounding $9,733 per year per household. So by global median, Americans are some of the most privileged motherfuckers out there. Not the most, because such titles are reserved for the residents of tax havens like Bermuda, Luxembourg, or Macau, but we'll put that aside for a moment. Then we're being told here that the incomes are up by 135%, which means that every $1 is now 2.35, unadjusted for inflation. Adjusted for inflation, the growth is far less spectacular, at about 5 to 7% in 40 years. So not exactly stagnant, as you will often hear on populist channels and even in this article, but still, it is true that is pretty slow real growth. Now, there are many reasons for that, chief among them being the Federal Reserve continuing to print money and lowering interest, which in turn makes credit cheaper than it should be, thus, well, incentivizing terrible decision-making. And on top of to that, there's terrible legislation, so you have a reasonable explanation. Now, not the whole explanation, but if these two were to be eliminated, things would be better. But these two won't be eliminated because nobody wants that. Yet for some reason, for some not exactly mysterious reason, youngsters today think they are poorer. Well, they kinda are, but not for the reasons they think so. Ceteris paribus, or in plain English, assuming all else being equal, youngsters today should be needing 2 or 3 years more than their parents to get a house to account for the increase of price in the housing market. But unfortunately, all else is not equal. Now, one can spend a bajillion years to argue about how things should be, and there are hundreds of thousands of channels on YouTube arguing about how things should be, but I'm not in that business, especially not in this video. So we'll only look at the things of how the things are rather than how they should be, and what can the individual do to change it for himself. Because really, the only one you can change effective immediately is yourself. So let's keep on reading. Quote, there we go. Average tuition at public four-year colleges went up 549%, not adjusted for inflation, according to data from the College Board. On the same basis, average per capita personal healthcare expenditures rose about 276% over a slightly shorter period, 1990 to 2017, according to data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And average housing prices swelled 188% over those 3 decades, according to Standard & Poor Core Logic Case-Shiller National Home Price Index. The costs of staying in the middle class are going up, said Adam Levitin, a Georgetown law professor who studies bankruptcy, financial regulation, and consumer finance. Now stop right there. So the price of a house is 188% higher with incomes 135% higher. In other words, the houses have become bigger, better, and only increased in pricing by roughly 25% in real terms. And that's over a span of 30 years. Well, that's not so bad, isn't it? Now, look up the evolution of prices for housing in most of Europe. And trust me, it's a lot higher than that. Now, the real shocker is the increase in the price of healthcare, 276%. Now, that's twice the wage increase, but that's the national, or should I say, the continental average. If we look at states with lower regulation and involvement in the sector, the increase doesn't look that bad. For instance, the second most expensive state in the Union is South Dakota, according to Business Insider, where healthcare costs are $8,286 per year, or 12% of the median income. Now, that may sound a lot to American leftists, but if you look at Europe, you will soon want to scream, "God bless the United States of America." I mean, leftists like to use percentage of the GDP in order to claim that the US spends more than Europe on healthcare. Now, that's sort of true, but it's still misleading. It doesn't particularly matter for the average Joe. You know what matters to the average Joe? How much the average Joe pays for his own healthcare out of his own income. And in that department, the United States fares a lot better. Now, in Europe, the cheapest countries force their citizens, or at least they try to force them, to pay 10% of their income per month into the national insurance scheme. And those are the cheap countries. In most countries, it's from 15% and upwards. Translation: the worst states in terms of healthcare expenses in the United States are still better than most of Europe. Also, in the US, poor people, or the so-called working poor, don't have to pay and get it subsidized. No such thing in Europe. Even if you make $500 a month, you're still docked $50 for the marvelous healthcare system that rarely works, it's always crowded, and almost always subpar. So while in the US sometimes insurers can suck, that's still preferable while they do their sucking because the patient gets to be alive. In Europe, nosocomial infections affect 1 in 18 patients on any given day. In the US, it's 1 in 31. And I could go on like this for a while, but the point is that most complaints about healthcare costs in the United States are not the complaints of poor people oppressed by a system that hates them, but the complaints of overly privileged, spoiled brats complaining that the cheap golden plate is not cheap enough. Now, admittedly, some of that comes from ignorance, as the American far left keeps on selling outright lies and multiple misleading stats in their attempt to make the plebs believe that Europe has somehow managed to do something that nobody was able to do in human history, namely to make socialism work, at least in one field. But the reality is that we didn't. Our healthcare sucks all over the continent, and the Americans have it better. No hate. Just facts. Anyway, the elephant in the room described by the Wall Street Journal is the tuition for public four-year colleges, which rose 549%, they say, not adjusted for inflation. A bit over 4 times than the wage increase. Now, a lot of videos have been made over the years to thoroughly explain that, and I will leave a few of them in the description for those who want to study more. But the gist is this. When you subsidize something, you get more of that something and more expensive version of that something. Before there was such thing as a Department of Education, American higher education was among the best in the world and second or third cheapest in the world. It all went downhill from there once the government got involved. And the negative trend accelerated with this idea of a federal guaranteed student loan. When that became a thing, things went worse and faster. Now, what did that mean? It meant that the colleges were now no longer bound to the market. Now, they could charge the students more because the students were not paying directly in cash out of their own pocket, but via a loan which was backed by the government, meaning that the college would get its money no matter what. In time, colleges found ingenious ways to justify increasing costs by making campuses look more like mini cities, or better yet, mini luxury cities, or simply by filling the institution with all sorts of useless bureaucracies, such as the Office of Civil Rights or the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and so on and so forth. All of that paid for via federally guaranteed loans, liberally signed off to any 18-year-old who doesn't know better and whose parents should know better, but they don't. And the parents don't know better because they believe the hype that going to college is somehow mandatory and not a scam, even though it almost always is a scam, especially in the United States, though it's true in Europe to a certain extent. Of course, there are degrees of the scam. Some are outright a pyramid scheme, like Egyptology or gender studies or European studies in Europe, or really any degree that can only be used to then teach other people that subject. And some are just a meager scam, like a law degree, for instance, for which you're paying more than you should simply because you're expected to rip off schmucks in frivolous lawsuits. So yeah, if you choose to waste your time in college, it's your fault. It really is. Meanwhile, telecom workers, or as they call them today, media and communication equipment workers, make about $80,000 a year without needing a degree. Now that's already above the median household income, and that income is very similar in Europe as well, by the way. Translation: get one of those jobs and you'll be debt-free and already significantly richer than the average household in America. And that's one of the low-tier jobs in the category that I like to call desirable jobs, namely jobs that don't require almost any paperwork, just hard work, willingness to learn, and non-idiocy. Oh, but you see, it's not prestigious, because it's not enough to be wealthy. You gotta be prestigious, man. Well, prestige costs money. You can be prestigious or you can be wealthy. You can't have them both while you're young. Yet for some reason, many still insist that they can, and fail while attempting to achieve it. And the prestige point is very relevant to the next portion of this article. Quote, Jonathan Guzman and Myra Final earn about $130,000 a year combined in technology jobs. Though that is more than double the median, that for their years at St. John's University in New York has been hard to overcome. The two 28-year-olds in West Hartford, Connecticut have about $51,000 in student debt plus $18,000 in auto loans and $50,000 across 8 credit cards. Adding financial pressure are a baby daughter and a mortgage of around $270,000. I'm normally a warrior, but this is next level stuff. I've never been more stressed, Mr. Guzman said. Never would I have thought with the amount we make I would have these problems. They no longer dine out several times a week. Other hits to their budget were hard to avoid, such as a wrecked car that forced them to borrow more. Miss Final hasn't used her TJ Maxx credit card in more than a year. She makes the minimum monthly payment on its balance of approximately $7,500. Her monthly statement says if she continues at this pace, she will need about 23 years to pay it off. Earlier this year, Mr. Guzman put his credit cards in a Ziploc bag with water and placed it in the freezer. In May, however, they went to 2 weddings and needed a card to cover the cost of a gift and the rental car. Mr. Guzman removed one of the credit cards from the freezer. A lot of things came at once, he said. Since then, he's taken the rest of them out too. U.S. households that have credit card debt owed an average of $8,390 in the first quarter of 2019, up 9% from 2015 when adjusted for inflation, according to an analysis of Federal Reserve data by research firm WalletHub.com. Taking on a mortgage to buy a house that could appreciate or borrowing for a college degree that should boost earning power can be wise decisions. Borrowing for everyday consumption or for assets such as cars that lose value makes it harder to save and invest in stocks and real estate that tend to create wealth. So the rise in consumer borrowing exacerbates the wealth gap, close quote. So, let me get this straight. You're up to your eyeballs in debt, and yet you go further in debt in order to go to a wedding? Are you fucking kidding me? And the wedding is another part in another part of the continent, clearly, since they needed a rental car as well. These are exactly the kind of people for which not only I can't have any empathy, but nobody should even attempt to have any empathy ever. Just use these cases to laugh at them. And I'm sorry, but if you can't get by on a household income that is 13 times higher than the global median, the problem is not your income. The problem is you. You can bet they vote Democrat too and complain about more income distribution, even though they are in the top 0.01% globally. Notice in the picture that their home has a granite countertops with a Brita water system or something similar anyway, sitting on the top of it. She's wearing an Apple Watch, which means she also has a newer iPhone. They also have a medium-sized dog. Just not having those would have made a serious dent into their debt problem. Big news though, they have sacrificed dining out multiple times per week. Oh, poor them. Give me a freaking break, mate. This couple is basically the epitome of the internet saying rich people stay rich by living like they're poor, and poor people stay poor by trying to live like what they think is rich people live like. Going into debt to attend a wedding? Sorry, I can't get that out of my head. Compare that, for instance, to Mark Zuckerberg, whose wedding was just a small gathering in his backyards with a few friends who didn't even know they were attending a wedding. Now that is how you do it. And this wedding thing is very common here too. But at least here, people save up in order to go to a wedding, which I still think is dumb, but at least they don't ruin their financials in order to attend the event. But going to a wedding on credit? That's just insane. $50,000 across 8 credit cards? That's beyond imagination for me. They're not even trying to be responsible. And this all comes during an excellent economic period when overall debt levels for consumers are still at an all-time low. So imagine how things will be for the irresponsible once the recession hits. And it will. There's a recession brewing in Germany which will affect all of Europe and portions of the United States of America for sure. And that's just the beginning, by the way. Yep, economic storm is coming again because people don't learn from their mistakes. Because no matter how many times you tell people that Keynesian economics don't work, nobody wants to listen. And they don't want to listen because my feelings, basically. So the Wall Street Journal continues to make exactly this point, that things are in a good period. Quote, the US economy roughly doubled in size from 1989 through 2016, data from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis show. Counted together, everyone got wealthier, but gains in assets owned were heavily skewed towards the highest earners, according to journal analysis of the Fed's Survey of Consumer Finances. The median net worth of households in the middle 20% of income rose 4% in inflation-adjusted terms to $81,900 between 1989 and 2016, the latest available data. For households in the top 20%, median net worth more than doubled to $811,860, and for the top 1%, the increase was 178% to $11,206,000. Put differently, the value of assets for all US households increased from 1989 through 2016 by an inflation-adjusted $58 trillion. A third of the gain went to the wealthiest 1%, according to the journal analysis of Fed data. On the surface, things look pretty good, but if you dig a little deeper, you see different subpopulations are not performing as well, said Chris DeRitis, deputy chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Counting all kinds of debt, including mortgages, consumers aren't nearly as debt-burdened as they once were. In the fourth quarter of 2007, the last year before the financial crisis struck, households devoted 13.2% of their disposable income to debt service. In the first quarter of 2019, that number was 9.9%, largely due to low interest rates. Partly because of widespread refinancing, mortgage payments since the start of 2017 have claimed the smallest slice of the disposable personal income in decades, in the low 4% range, according to Fed data. Other debts, such as auto and student loans and credit card borrowing, consumed about 5.7% of disposable personal income in the first quarter. That was up from a low 4.9% at the end of 2012 and back to 2009 level. In contrast to a mortgage, most of this borrowing went to fund consumption. Close quote. Translation. People are getting more irresponsible than in the past, even if the economy has been great for those seeking to invest, even for those seeking to invest on credit. The difference is, however, that unlike the early 2000s, the new generation of debtors have nothing to show for the debt, which, by the way, will make for a nice drama when the recession hits. What are you going to take from these people? I mean, seriously, you're going to take away their smartphone? These people own nothing. They're worth less than nothing, even though they make some of the highest incomes in the history of mankind. And yet it's still not enough, we're being told. Terrible. The journal continues with another case, very similar, or actually worse. Quote, Elizabeth and Andy Bowerly, I have no idea how to pronounce their name, I don't care, have been trying to buy a house for 7 years without success, despite having combined income of about $155,000 in the top 20% of households, according to census data. The two 34-year-olds face a common conundrum. Their jobs are in the Seattle metro area. In cities with strong job and wage growth such as theirs, rising real estate prices can put home ownership out of reach, even for families that rate as very well off by overall national standards. This family have $30,000 in their down payment fund, but the kind of house they want, a 2-bedroom, 2-bath with a yard, starts at around $600,000 in and around Seattle. They figured they would need to make a down payment of $70,000 to keep the mortgage payment manageable given their other obligations. These include student loan debt of around $88,000 that consumes around $1,000 of income every month. Mrs. Bowerly, I have no idea, said about half of their take-home pay goes out the door for that, plus $1,750 in rent and $1,200 in childcare for their son. $4,000 of our income is immediately spoken for, she said. Like many families, they have stretched out the monthly payments on an auto loan. They have a 2013 Subaru bought used 3 years ago. They won't write that last $240 monthly check on the car until it is about 9 years old, close quote. Well, these ones are slightly smarter, but not by much. I mean, first of all, what's with those prices on cars? Now, I looked up cheap cars in Seattle and I found cars better than theirs for prices between $5,000 and $9,000. Of course, used cars, but theirs is used as well. And yet these guys bought theirs used and still paying $3,000 a year on it? They already paid more than if they were to buy a used car every 3 years. And if I could find better deals just by Google in 5 minutes, I'm sure that them living there can find even better deals. But you know, they just have to work for it. Same goes with houses. I mean, it simply isn't true that the starting price of a house is $600,000 in and around Seattle. Again, using this magic tool called the internet, I was able to find houses in the Seattle metro area that fit their own criteria at a bit under $400,000. That's what, 34% less than the figure they themselves advanced? And I also found a lot of them between 400 and 420K, all in suburbs with an A or A+ in public schools and the size they said they want. And if I can do that, why can't they? Now, I'm not saying that $400,000 is a good price. It certainly isn't, and it sure does need a correction, which will happen in the next recession. But what I'm saying is that if one applies just basic common sense, suddenly a huge chunk of the problems these people complain about become a bit more manageable. And this is really the crux of the matter. These people haven't been allowed to fail when they should have failed, namely years ago, before going $50,000 in debt just on consumer spending alone. But then again, way too many people, especially young people, have been indoctrinated thoroughly that there's nothing they can do, that their agency is limited, even when it isn't. I've seen this myself talking to youngsters in Chicago in similar situations last year when I went to the US. They legitimately believe that such thing as debt-free doesn't exist and cannot be achieved. When I told them that the vast majority of the Earth, of the population on Earth is debt-free, I got blank stares. Not a request for evidence, but just a blank stare. I did get a request for evidence when I told them that the total amount of shekels that I owed at the time was a resounding $35, or was it 38? I don't know, something in that ballpark, which was the electricity bill that I simply forgot to pay before I left home and couldn't send my girlfriend to pay it either because she was out of the country as well. That was also the time when I realized just how upside down America's youth are when approaching finances. These people will for sure get shredded in the next recession. And then they'll blame everyone else but themselves. The boomers, the government, the banks, everyone will once again be at fault, just not themselves. I mean, this is probably why I bother making this video, really, because someone will have to tell these people that no, it's not the boomers, it's not the evil capitalists, it's not the 1%, in fact almost all of Americans are part of the global 1%, it's you first and foremost. Sure, the government, and especially the Federal Reserve, specifically the Federal Reserve, and the government policy does play a role, but that role can easily be worked around by common sense. Like, you know, not spending $50,000 with your credit card to go to a wedding. Jesus Christ. Anyway, the journal continues, quote, Families such as this one, who want to live in a solid middle-class neighborhoods with good schools and reasonable commutes, are increasingly renting single-family homes. Taking advantage of this trend, the private equity firm Blackstone Group Incorporated, with other investors, launched a business that is now the nation's largest renter of single-family houses. The number of households that have inflation-adjusted annual incomes of $100,000 or greater but are renters nearly doubled from 2006 to 2016, according to the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. Dominique Pourviance, a senior financial specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, said people earning the median income can no longer afford the median-priced new home, costing $323,000 last year, and barely have the means to buy the median existing home, which is now about $278,000. That's a radical shift in the structure of the market, Mr. Pourviance said. What we may have to prepare for in the future is that buying a new home, and in some markets even buying an existing home, may become a luxury. The squeeze is likely even tighter because his affordability calculation doesn't take into account buyers' other debts, and it assumes a 20% down payment. Home buyers' median down payment in the third quarter last year was only 7.6%, according to Atom Data Solutions, close quote. Now, most Western Europeans can't empathize with this at all, because home ownership already is kind of a luxury in Western Europe already. But I'm from Eastern Europe, and specifically from the country with the highest rate of home ownership in Europe. So as a result, I have a higher degree of empathy for these poor souls. Now, with that said, one has to remember that there has to be a balance. If you want flexibility, then home ownership is not conducive to that. The people profiled for this article are essentially yuppies, and one of the characteristics of this demographic tends to sport is to be essentially anywheres. Now, the yuppies profiled by the Wall Street Journals want to become somewheres, but don't know how. Then there is the issue that is very common in the US and the United Kingdom and largely unheard of in continental Europe, namely to treat your home like a speculative commodity rather than, like your home. And this is a very serious difference that will not change anytime soon at a societal level, though you can change it for yourself individually should you want that. In continental Europe, we don't follow the news on the value of property unless we intend to buy additional property. If we own a house, we don't get uneasy if a downturn is coming because, as a rule, we don't intend to sell our house anyway. Also, in smaller cities and especially in towns, the standard still is, from Germany all the way to Georgia or Armenia and anything in between, the standard still is to build our own homes. We buy a lot of land and then build on it. And at least portions of it we physically contribute to the work. Not just to save on cash, but also as part of the tradition, because it's not really your house unless you personally worked on it, even if just a little. This is still true in Germany, true in most of Eastern Europe, except big cities, I guess, even there sometimes. And it's true in Greece, it's true in Balkans, it's true at least in southern Italy, and so on and so forth. Now, Americans could do that too, but in some areas of the US they really can't, because there's another issue: zoning laws. Now, I'll talk about zoning laws in a separate video where I'll put my 10 things that I think deeply suck about the USA. I know, I've been promising that one for a while too, but it's coming. But until then, let's put it this way. Local town halls in some areas of the United States absolutely suck. It's strange how young people put so much energy into getting politically involved at the federal level, even though most of the direct oppression by authority against them comes from their city hall. And zoning laws are the prime reason for why small houses are in short supply. And why do these zoning laws exist? Because too many people have this mentality that their home is not really their home, but rather something to look out to sell. Nevertheless, zoning laws aren't federal, and areas with lax or no zoning laws do exist even close to metropolitan centers. 1 or 2 hours drive, sometimes even closer than that, so you should consider trying that. Yeah. I know, it's hard, but then again, nothing good in life comes easy. Doing the way I suggest could also shrink the cost of a house quite substantially, thus increasing the degree of individual freedom. But then again, it's not the inability to have a house that these UPs are concerned with. It's the inability to be perceived as middle class, even though they make wages that put them firmly into the upper class. Wall Street Journal continues, quote, "Nowhere is the struggle to maintain a middle-class lifestyle more apparent than in cars. The average new car price in the US was $37,285 in June, according to Kelley Blue Book. It didn't deter buyers. The industry sold or leased at least 17 million cars each year from 2015 to 2018, its best 4-year stretch ever. Partly because of demand satisfied by that run, sales are projected to be off modestly this year." How households earning $61,000 can acquire cars costing half of their gross income is a story of the financialization of the economy. Some 85% of new cars in the first quarter of this year were financed, including leases, according to Experian. That is up 76% in the first quarter of 2009. And 32% of new car loans were for 6 to 7 years. A decade ago, only 12% were that long. Still, 12% is too much. The shorter-term loans of the past gave many owners several years of driving without car payments. Now, a third of new car buyers roll debt from their old loans into a new one. That's up from roughly 25% in the years before the financial crisis. The average amount rolled into the new loan is just over $5,000, according to Edmunds, an auto industry research firm. Leasing, which often entails lower payments than purchase loans, accounted for 34% of financed new vehicles in the first quarter, up from 20% a decade earlier, according to Experian. Drivers of used cars also financed them. More than half did just that last year, close quote. And again, my only question still remains, why? I mean, this mentality is completely alien to me. In fact, one of my best financial decisions was to not own a car. But I get it. You can't really get by without a car in the United States unless you live in the DC metro area, which is the only place where I did meet Americans who don't own a car. But just because you need a car, does it really have to be the latest C-Classe Mercedes? $38,000? You can buy a house for that money. And no, not in Eastern Europe, but in the good old USA. I found in 5 minutes a 680 square meters house to buy for $44,000 in Oklahoma City. Instead of a new car, if I were those people, I'd buy one of those properties and then rent it out until I got old and then move there as my retirement. Of course, you don't move to Oklahoma City when you're 27, but when you're 67? Why not? Way too many Americans no longer conceive of having a property for 50 years. The smart ones do, though. I mean, Warren Buffett still lives in the same house that he bought 60 years ago. Oh, maybe he's stupid. Also, a third of new car buyers roll debt from their old loans into a new one. What are these people even thinking? I'm serious. What is in the minds of these people? I mean, seriously, if you're one of those people, tell me in the comments, what's the thought process? I mean, if you couldn't afford your last car, what makes you think getting into more debt to get another shiny, fast depreciating object will be okay? If you're one of those people, please do describe to me in the comments. I want to understand the mindset and the thought process behind such decisions, because it's completely alien to me. And it is a mindset that is peculiar even inside the United States, let alone to Europe. In fact, I could understand the emergence of such a mindset in Europe, where eco-Marxist laws have made it all but impossible to own a car older than 10 years or so. But in the US, the regulations are much lighter, and with some care, one can take a car made in 2011 and use it for another 6 or 7 years at the very least, all in cash and with no car payment. And it seems, the way the Wall Street Journal describes it, the main reason many people don't do that is because of hubris. They want to live in the prestige economy and care deeply about appearances rather than, functionality. And prestige, well, prestige costs money. That's why prestige is the purview of the very rich and not of the middle class. But then again, what do I know? I'm just a dude with a camera. Well, 2 cameras. Anyway, let's keep on reading. Quote, one of the last stops for strapped consumers is personal loans, which often offer lower interest rates than credit cards and usually offer fixed monthly payments with a set end date. Banks pulled out of the sector after losses during the financial crisis, but solid recent returns have drawn in financial technology startups. And many big banks, including Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated, Citigroup Incorporated, and SunTrust Banks Incorporated, are in the business. The unsecured loans are often pitched to consolidate credit card debt as well as for home renovations, vacations, and unexpected expenses. Personal loan balances totaled the record $138 billion at the end of last year versus $46 billion at the end of 2011, according to credit reporting firm TransUnion. The partial federal government shutdown that ended in January exposed the vulnerability of many consumers. Discover Financial Services said thousands of government workers told it they were unable to make the minimum payments on their credit cards and the monthly payments they owed on personal loans and private student loans. Discover waived fees the company Discovered waived fees allowed customers to skip a payment and held off on reporting missed payments to credit reporting firms. In case of a broad economic downturn, these people's debt levels could weigh on the economy for an extended period because people who carry a lot of debt into a downturn tend to rein in their spending for years afterward. Close quote. Right. I remember mentioning this with the government workers. I mentioned it in a Good News video episode. I have no idea which episode, but I remember mentioning it, where I highlighted that it is a good thing that the government shutdown not only led to the resignations of some government employees. I mean, any bureaucrat that resigns and is never replaced is good news in and of itself, but also highlighted just how fiscally irresponsible bureaucrats are even in their own lives. And that's why you shouldn't trust them to manage your money. And the Wall Street Journal is right, of course, that the overall economy will suffer a bit because of this, but that suffering would not have happened to begin with if individuals were more responsible with their finances. So what to do? Don't be like those people, or like the people presented in the last part of the article. Quote, Angelo and Noelle Young of La Vie in Arizona are going through their own economic downturn. The two-child couple earned just over $100,000 until 2017. They had a roughly $106,000 mortgage, about $97,000 in student loan debt, and $24,000 in car loans. Then Miss Young, 33, moved from a full-time to a part-time faculty position at a university because of its budget cuts. With income reduced to around $70,000, they still felt confident enough in their earning power to borrow $48,000 to finance 2 cars in 2017. Let me read that again. With income reduced to around $70,000, they still felt confident enough in their earning power to borrow additional $48,000 to finance 2 new cars. They rolled $13,000 of loan balances after trade-ins into loans for 2 modestly priced vehicles, a 2014 Hyundai Santa Fe and a new Chevrolet Cruze. The $1,070 monthly car payments were manageable until Mr. Young, 40, left his job working for the city after incurring several pay cuts. "We both had solid situations," Miss Young said. "Then mine became the dicey one, and then we both got into dicey situations." After another job didn't work out, Mr. Young switched to selling real estate and driving for Uber and Lyft. The family's income slipped to $58,000. Mr. Young cashed out $8,000 from a pension to pay off a credit card balance racked up last year. The two have been able to postpone student loan payments, citing financial hardship and Miss Young's PhD studies. The Youngs have cut back on gym memberships, stopped buying organic groceries, and cancelled cable TV. Miss Young was recently hired as an adjunct professor at another university beginning this fall. Growing up, Mr. Young says he was taught to work hard to get a nice house and a reliable vehicle. Now he realizes how easily borrowing too much can undermine this plan. "Things we were taught could be assets aren't really assets," he said. "They are liabilities." I mean, imagine that this is the allegedly the success story by so-called modern standards. I guess the fact that their mortgage is a more reasonable one kind of counts as a success. Nevertheless, your income gets cut by 30% and yet you borrow more than half of your annual income to buy 2 cars, of which one of them is brand new? Really? Anyway, you can buy 2 good cars for $10,000. So I'm just saying. But no, they had to borrow $48,000. You see, it's not prestigious. What do you mean by a $5,000 car? No, that's terrible. No, let's borrow $50,000 because that's better. Then the wife continues her PhD studies while at the same time working at a part-time job. And they have 2 kids? I mean, how about drop the fucking PhD and spend that time at home with your children, which doesn't create additional debt, and it's also fundamentally valuable for your future and the future of your children. And with that extra time, I don't know, make some money, make some extra money on the side. I have people in my family, though admittedly men, not women, who did that. It's a lot more useful than a PhD, trust me. Also, notice in the picture that Mr. Young wears an Apple Watch. So he has a newish iPhone as well. Now that doesn't sound like smart spending at all. But hey, they sacrificed a lot, you see. No more gym, they reduced their cable TV bill, and no more organic vegetables, which are just like normal vegetables, but 5 times more expensive because people are not stupid. People are fucking stupid. But you know, they went to a huge sacrifice, you see. And the funniest part of all of this is that these people are using money they don't have to make purchases that are totally unnecessary, and I guess solely to impress people they don't even like. I mean, I've met a few people like these ones when I was in the US. That's why I dedicated such a long video to this article, because the stories profiled in it are, in my opinion, pretty representative for the demographic that they want to profile. And let me tell you something. These people are miserable. They're not happy. Their interhuman relationships with others are terrible. Yet they put themselves in a financial hole to impress exactly the people they don't like. Namely, other folks just as miserable as they are, all playing this pretend game, and that none of them can afford anyway. But notice one thing, well actually 2 things, that are missing from this article. The obvious one is taxes. They all live in deeply leftist, high-taxed areas. Well, that's not the market's fault, but it's their fault. But besides that, notice that nowhere in the article is even implied, let alone suggested, that maybe, just maybe, they should work more. I know, that's haram because more oppression and shit. But the reality is that the people quoted here are 28, 33, and 34. Yet they want to have what their parents had way into their late 50s. Well, that is doable, but only if you work harder and spend less. The parents built their lifestyle over decades, but what's the name of the first couple here? the Guzmans, they're both aged 28. I'm sorry, but home ownership in a highly expensive area at age 28, that's not them being oppressed. It's them suffering from the hubris that they're somehow better and smarter than reality. How many average 28-year-olds own a house in Europe? Not that many, really. I mean, the average age for the first-time buyer is 33, but surprise, surprise, that Europe average is taken downward by England and Ireland. Yes, specifically England, not the UK overall. And that average is still mostly in more modest areas where housing is cheaper. There aren't that many 28-year-olds owning a house in the suburbs of München, Warsaw, London, Paris, Krakow, Dubrovnik or Cluj-Napoca. So fundamentally, what is missing from the mentality of too many youngsters today is the basic value of delayed gratification. It's normal to want to have stuff, and it's normal to want to have them now. What's not normal is to have no self-control and spend impulsively from funds you don't even have. But even that wouldn't be so bad if youngsters wouldn't throw themselves into the other huge black hole, namely student loans. Now, I said earlier that those are, for the most part, with very few exceptions, a scam. But what is the extent of the scam? Well, it can get pretty bad really fast, especially when combining naivete, outright stupidity, and the unwillingness to just say no. And this is the topic for another article for this video, which, although, yeah, it's getting pretty long, but I'd rather put everything here so I don't have to make a part 3. It takes quite a while to make these kinds of videos, and if I stay too much on a topic, I get bored. Besides, there's so much that needs to be done these months that I'm finally not traveling. Anyway, so CNBC, more student loan borrowers carry 6-figure balances. Quote, Elisha Bookman has been out of school for 8 years. Still, her student loan balance is $500,000. Today, for her doctorate degree in naturopathic medicine and master's in acupuncture from Bastyr University, she owes $499,322.69. Now, this is a spectacle. $500,000 for a doctorate degree in disdainful bullshit. It's almost too easy, really. I mean, it's almost no wonder. It really is no wonder Quakery masquerading as medicine is such big business. With so many gullible fools being willing to put themselves $500,000 in the hole, why not? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't pity neither the practitioners nor their patients, because I'm a firm believer in people's right to be wrong. But at the same time, voting for candidates to forgive student debt for this kind of quackery is immoral and it's theft, and that's when I start caring. Anyway, quote, she and her husband struggled to buy a house because of her debt. Eventually, the financial stress led them to a divorce. He felt like he couldn't live his life or do the things he wanted to do. Bookman, age 38, said she wanted to open her own medical practice, but she said her student debt prevents her from getting a business loan. It really affects the remainders of your life, Bookman said. There is no out. Close quote. At least in this case, justice has been served. She's 38, hitting the wall, no children, no assets, and divorced. Good! CNBC quote, the average college graduate leaves school $30,000 in the red today, up from $10,000 in the 1990s, yet much larger balances are becoming more common. Around 178,000 graduate students owed more than 100,000 in the 2015-16 academic year, up from 51,000 in 2003-04, according to Mark Kantrovitz, the publisher of savingforcollege.com. In the first quarter of 2019, over 6% of all student loan borrowers owed more than $100,000, up for 5.4% in 2017. Recently, Democratic presidential candidates Elizabeth Warren and Bolshevik Bernie Sanders have proposed forgiving student debt. Warren's plan would reduce people's tabs by up to $50,000, whereas Sanders' plan would erase it all, close quote. And this is the crux of the matter. These people aren't allowed to fail on their own, thus at least giving them the opportunity to learn from the mistakes. Whether they'll take that opportunity or not is a different story, but at this point they're not even allowed to. While it is not technically true that one can't file for bankruptcy to wipe off student loan debt, it is true that doing that is so complicated that it might as well be forbidden. Link in the description for those wanting to read more about how to file for bankruptcy against the student loans. So this is one aspect that needs to change, that is indeed outside of the control of the individual. Ability to easily file for bankruptcy just like any other type of debt. But where individual fault does appear is on the decision to try to rob the taxpayer in order to cover for your bad decisions. $500,000 for a doctorate degree in bullshitology is not the fault of the 1% or the fault of the government or the fault of capitalism or the markets or boomers or you name it. It simply isn't. Quote, Rebecca Grable loves her job as a pharmacy manager at Walgreens. But to study at the University of Oklahoma to become a doctor of pharmacy, she borrowed more than $310,000 and said the debt has limited her options. A few years ago, when she tried to buy a car, she said more than 11 banks denied her a loan. I feel like I'm stuck under it, Grable 27 said. Balancing other bills is a challenge. I just never imagined being a professional who still lives paycheck to paycheck, she said. Close quote. And there you have it. These people have swallowed hook, line and sinker a narrative that has little to no connection with reality. Now, I've seen individuals who are otherwise quite smart who want to lay the blame on the advertising industry. The argument being that these people were convinced by careful marketing, which convinced them that the real middle-class lifestyle is actually poverty, and in turn convinced them to get into debt to try to emulate what can reasonably be described more like an ultra-rich lifestyle. Such an argument would make sense, at least in part, if these people had been brought up in a lab somewhere on a DARPA island with no connection to other humans, specifically older humans who sometimes might have been related to them, something which we'd call, parents or something. Now, are we still allowed to say parents, or is that LGBTQ unfriendly? But these people were not brought up on a DARPA facility, but brought up alongside tens of millions of fellow countrymen who did not make the same mistake, even though those fellow countrymen were, as well, subjected to the same allegedly manipulative marketing tactics. That's why I ain't buying the, oh, they were manipulated by Wall Street marketing claptrap. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. Manipulation only works if the subject is, at least in part, willing to cooperate. And these subjects were more than willing, more than in part, to cooperate. It's that fucking simple. Quote, Buckman's and Grable's financial records were reviewed by the CNBC. Borrowers with huge balances should make a budget to get their spending under control, Kantorowicz said. It's a good idea to assign each expense to a category like need versus want. Then he suggests paying off your loans with the highest interest rates first to save money in the long run. The name of the game is paying the least amount over time, said Betsy Mayotte, the president of the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, a nonprofit that helps student loan borrowers with free advice and dispute resolution. At studentloans.gov, she said, you can figure out the best repayment plan for you. For example, income-driven repayment plans cap your monthly bill at a portion of your earnings. This tool not only tells you what your payment will be under each repayment plan, but how much you would pay over time and whether anything would be forgiven, Mayoti said. Forgiven student loan debt is considered taxable income, so Mayoti recommends putting aside money for that eventual bill. If the tax owed is unaffordable, the IRS offers payment plans, she said, adding that in some cases the amount owed is even forgiven. The IRS also allows student loan borrowers to deduct up to $2,500 a year from their taxable money. So there you go. Some free advice too. Now, will anyone listen? No, of course not. It will only get worse. You can bet on that. And there are at least 3 reasons for that, for why it will only get worse. 1, because deep character flaws can't be corrected overnight. And deep character flaws are one of the root causes. And fixing that will require one or several mentors. Also, it will require patience and at least 3 years of hard work, give or take. Without mentors and only a strong will and patience, it goes north of 5 years in a best-case scenario. It can be done, but it's not easy. Reason number 2, free advice is problematic. Now, I do apologize for using the word problematic, but there's no way I can describe this any other way. On one hand, there's a quirk in human nature that tends to take free advice less seriously than it takes advice for which the individual paid for. Whether it's in money, services rendered, or products, it doesn't matter. If the individual traded something for that piece of advice, the individual is more likely to take it seriously. And this is regardless of how good the advice is. On the other hand, there is almost no way of filtering good and bad advice in the market of free of charge advice. That is to say, if I give crappy advice in my consultations, soon enough nobody will pay for my advice and I go out of business. That's a filtering mechanism. But if one gives crappy advice for free, there is no filtering mechanism. And no, YouTube comment sections, Yelp reviews, and so on and so forth, those are not a good metric. So yeah, problematic is the word I would use to describe free of charge advice. And all in all, advice for free, even if very good advice, like the one quoted by the CNBC from the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, is likely to be discarded more often than not. And reason number 3 is the hardest one because it is the way beyond the control of the individual, and it is the reason is the structural belief. And when I say structural, I mean that in toto. For instance, look up the video 10 Myths About Government Debt by Learn Liberty, link in the description. This warped value system of neglecting debt is omnipresent. Sure, in some countries things are slightly better, but the situation in which the United States finds itself is pretty representative for most of the world. So you have anything from dumb lowlives who go $500,000 in debt for bullshitology studies, and all the way up to government officials and presidents who work on deficits that will have to be corrected the hard way at some point in time. And that, my fellow deplorables, is the textbook definition of a structural problem. And it's reason number 3 for why things will not get better overall. But the good news is that individuals can make things better overall for themselves by simply not being like that. One more thing that I should have mentioned earlier, but I forgot. The language used in describing these issues can be tricky sometimes. Specifically, for instance, they use the word household a lot, but what a household means has also changed over time. In the 1970s, a household meant 4 or 5 people, 1 elderly, 2 minors, and 2 adults. In the current year, a household usually means 2 adults. But anyway, I'll go more into that when I'll make the video about common manipulations of statistics. I'll stop here now because this video is already kind of long. Sure, this channel has seen longer than that, but still. Okay, yeah, so what do you all think? Can you give alternative explanations? How do you guide your own finances? Are you aware of any specific services or schemes that could help others too? I mean, let's keep that conversation going, because much sooner than expected, our greatest asset will be our mental health and our not being a leech lifestyle. So yeah, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Visit our website, subscribe to our social media, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.